Chapter 5 Classes. Belle was unpleasantly roused from her four-poster bed by an alarm clock that screeched. "It's your first day at Hogwarts, wouldn't want to be late," incessantly until everyone was out of their beds. Although it had taken a bit to haul herself out of bed, Belle was thankful that she wasn't the only one who found it difficult to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. One girl with long chestnut hair actually managed to ignore the cruel alarm for almost 10 minutes. She hadn't paid much attention to it the previous night, being completely exhausted, but now she was able to take a good look at her new dormitory. The room was spacious, even with 10 large, green-draped four-poster beds spaced along the walls. This was partially because the beds and accompanying wardrobes were tucked into little indentations in the wall, giving each girl at least some privacy and leaving the center of the room clear. Other than the space, the second thing that Belle noticed about the room was how green it was. The carpet running along the length of the room was green and black, and it looked luxuriously thick and soft. The tapestries on the wall and beds were in emerald hues, and softened the harshness of the stone walls, floor, and ceiling. But most astonishingly, even the light was green. The flames in the fireplace burned emerald, and from outside the slitted windows high on the walls, the filtered light from the outside world was also green. Almost as if filtered through water. Are we under the lake? No, that's not possible. Belle put on her uniform, still gazing in wonder at the room, and looked to see Kat still in her pajamas. "What are you doing, Kat? You should be getting dressed," Belle said, her heart sinking. Kat crossed her arms defiantly and sat down on her unmade bed with an exasperated huff. "No way am I wearing that dingy old uniform. It's ridiculous. You can't look me in the eye and tell me that you like it. Besides, do they actually expect us to wear skirts? Every single day?" Belle rolled her eyes and reached into her trunk to grab her brush. It's not that they were ugly. No, they weren't ugly. Kat just detested skirts, not that Belle liked them that much either. The shirts were plain white button-downs, and the gray wool sweaters were adorned with the Slytherin emblem. And robes, emerald green on the inside, she assumed were to be worn at all times, given the rather chilly mountain air outside. The skirts, however, were a different story. Pleats and all, they were going to look like Muggle schoolgirls from decades ago. "You're right, they definitely leave something to be desired. I don't like skirts much more than you do." Belle sighed as she brushed her hair, somewhat unsuccessfully, but managed to tie it up behind her head in a sloppy ponytail. "But you still have to wear them today, whether you like it or not. Leave the inevitable skirt crusade until at least tomorrow, please." Belle grabbed the skirt from Kat's uniform off the ground and threw it at her. "We've had this conversation before, after Diagon Alley, remember? You promised to behave for the first few days. Come on, or Scorpius and I will just have to leave you." Breakfast was pretty good, at least in Belle's opinion. Kat didn't like it because it had eggs. Kat didn't enjoy eggs, and she was still quietly fuming from the skirt debacle earlier. Scorpius was rather pleased with the uniform, and had even taken the time to make an effort with his hair instead of letting it hang over his eyes like normal. Of course, the sight of Scorpius's nice black pants had elicited another round of barely audible growling from Kat. As they walked, Belle realized for the first time exactly how many students there were at Hogwarts. The hallways were filled past bursting, students were pushing and shoving, and there was a decent amount of yelling reverberating as older kids tried to navigate their younger siblings toward their classes, or away from the classes as the case may be. Belle distinctly heard one first-year informed that Potions was in a tower. If Belle hadn't been clinging to Scorpius and Kat, she would have definitely gotten lost as well. She had imagined that Hogwarts would be a sort of grand, stoic kind of place, the hallways eerily empty, yet enchantingly alluring. At the moment, it was definitely chaotic and loud. Scorpius veered to the right down a staircase that led to the section of the dungeons where Potions classes were held. Thankfully, Belle had overheard from some older Slytherins lecturing other first-years, so she knew it was directly down the hall from the Slytherin common room. The dungeons were a bit less crowded, since the only class held down in them was Potions, and the crowd gradually thinned down till there were only thoroughly confused Gryffindor and Slytherin first-years. The dungeons, in contrast to the Slytherin common room, were dark, damp, and dimly lit. "These dungeons are so musty, it'll be a miracle if I go the whole year without getting sick from it," Kat complained as the three of them strolled into the classroom. "Come on, Kat," Scorpius groaned, sharing a long-suffering look with Belle. Although Kat was normally good-natured, if something annoyed her, the mood had a tendency to last all day. The Potions classroom, to Belle's surprise, was well-lit and roomy. Apparently only dungeon corridors were neglected. There were probably 10 or 20 high-top tables strewn around the room, with stools pushed neatly underneath them. Each table could easily hold 5 students in their cauldrons. Against one wall was an unnerving cabinet full of something or other that had to be secured with a steel padlock the size of a textbook. Bill made a mental note not to go near it. The blackboard at the front of the class had a large amount of poor handwriting scrawled across it. Formulas, equations, some sort of list, Belle couldn't tell. Multiple white stubs of chalk were laid at the bottom of the board, along with an eraser that had seen better days. No teacher was in the classroom, so students wandered around the classroom or sat at the desks with their friends. She noticed James walked in and nudged Scorpius and Cat toward a few desks near the back of the room, as far away from the strange boar as they could get. James entered the room hesitantly, not knowing anyone. People who asked for autographs definitely didn't count, he decided, shuddering as he spotted the girl that had been willing to pay Teddy from last night, waving at him from the front row. When his eyes landed on Belle, Scorpius, and Cat, he turned in the opposite direction. He eventually decided on a desk in the front of the class, occupied by a kind-looking Gryffindor girl, whom he had not noticed the night before in the swarm of students being directed to dormitories. James pulled out magical draughts and potions by Arsenius Jigger, extracted his quill and ink, and dropped his bag down with a thump on the scuffed floor. He quickly became bored with the class, as it seemed nothing would be done today, so he pulled out the small composition notebook he had dedicated to potions and began to formulate a scathing letter to his parents. He had heard from students who were wandering towards the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, murmuring something about Harry Potter, and this, combined with his experience last night, had combined to make him furious. How could they send me here without saying anything? He fumed as he scrawled out the letter. In the back of the room, a door unseen by almost all the first years swung open to reveal the most average-looking man Belle had ever seen. He walked right past her, and she stared curiously at him until he turned around to face the class. The man was of middling height, but had no interesting or distinctive features. His hunched posture, mousy brown hair parted on the left, and his rectangular glasses would have been equally at home anywhere. His eyes were also a dull brown color, Belle observed as he scanned the classroom. His robes were all black, and he seemed relatively normal. At least as normal as any wizard could really be, and spectacularly average for Hogwarts, according to some of the stories Belle had heard at the manor. Hogwarts teachers usually ran more on the werewolf or half-giant end of the spectrum. He turned sharply on his heels and began to clean the blackboard with the beat-up eraser. The man dropped it when he was done and picked up a stub of white chalk, scrawling a name in the same horribly legible handwriting on the board. The noise of the clock screeching across the blackboard made numerous students, including Belle, wince in their seats. The man, whom Belle had officially decided was the most boring teacher in the world, tossed the chalk down on the table in front of him and finally took it upon himself to address the class. "Hello, class." He pompously straightened out his robes and began to pace around the front of the room. "My name is Evander Thorne, Professor Thorne to all of you. I hope you will remember to stay awake in my class." He slammed his hand down on the desk of a student who had decided to attempt to catch up on the sleep the awful alarm clocks had deprived them all of. "And if you do such and apply yourself in my class, you will do fine." Professor Thorne turned around and continued to lecture the class about the do's and don'ts of potions, probably his standard first day of school spiel. The teacher had very clearly lost the attention of half the class. Students' heads were nodding and eyes were drooping. Some kids even had their heads on the table and eyes closed, napping, almost up to Bin's legendary standards, thought Belle dimly. James was nearly done with his letter to his parents when Professor Thorne pounced. "Mr. Potter." "Yes, sir." James hastily closed the cover of his notebook before Thorne could see it, and fervently hoped the ink that had yet to dry didn't smear. "Since you obviously know so much about what not to do when brewing a potion that you find you can so carelessly ignore me, should you or should you not begin brewing before you've read all the instructions?" he snapped. Despite knowing the answer, something he felt was painfully obvious, James felt a slight twinge of embarrassment for being pointed out. He shifted uneasily in his seat and opened his mouth to speak, only to be cut off by Professor Thorne. "Just as I thought. You may consider paying attention in class before letting the status of your parents pollute your judgment," he sneered before turning away. Belle found herself stifling a laugh at Professor Thorne's comment to James, but at the same time confused. What did James' parents have to do with how he acted in class? James seemed to be a perfectly normal, mildly terrified first year. What was so special about him? The rest of the class seemed to be in on the joke, judging by the snickers that were much too loud to be just pleasure at another's misfortune and relief about their own escape. Belle pulled a piece of paper out of her notebook and wrote a note to Scorpius. Scorpius, who actually had been doing his best to pay attention in class, jolted a bit when Belle elbowed him to draw his attention to her note. He picked it up and read it quickly. Do you think James's parents had anything to do with mine? Scorpius looked to Belle and shrugged. He scrawled back, I couldn't tell you, but it's worth checking out. The adults at home certainly don't like Harry Potter much, so that's promising. Belle began to write a response when she noticed Professor Thorne glaring at her as she spoke. She didn't want to be the second victim of his ridicule in the first 20 minutes of class, so she gently set down the pill and whispered to Scorpius, We'll talk about this later. When potions had ended, much to every student's pleasure, James found himself wandering the halls of Hogwarts by himself. He had no actual friends on his own year with whom he could walk from class to class, well, at least not yet. James fully intended to make plenty of friends, but definitely not that Belle girl from the train, he thought. James rushed up the staircase out of the dungeons and felt some of the older students shove past him, almost sending him tumbling back down the flight. He barely regained his balance and managed to push his way through the crowded hallways towards where Teddy and Victory had told him the Defense Against the Dark Arts class was held. He had been curious as to why the class was still necessary, considering there hadn't been any major threat against all of wizardkind in years. According to his dad, even the R office had been quiet for ages. The classroom came up on his left sooner than James had anticipated. The only reason he didn't pass it was because of the swarm of first-year Gryffindors crowding into the space. It was larger than the potions dungeon, but James assumed that was because they had to practice spells, and a confined space wouldn't work well for spell work. The room felt cramped, however, due to the 4 rows of 10 desks each, 2 seats per desk. Nearly every seat was taken by the time James managed to shove his way through the door. He scanned the room for an empty seat, and there were only 2 he found, one right in front of the teacher's desk and another near the middle of the classroom. Pushing through students, James fought his way to the desk in the middle of the room and sat down next to a girl he had, again, failed to notice the previous night. He set his bag down on the floor and turned to the girl. I'm James Potter. What's your name? He tried to sound as friendly as possible, so as not to come off as arrogant or snarky. That seemed to be most people's opinion of him. Potter? You mean Harry Potter's son? The girl asked, seemingly amazed. Yes, but I already told you who I was. What's your name? James already regretted his decision to introduce himself, annoyed with whatever was so fascinating about his father. No need to be rude, the girl remarked as she pushed a strand of light brown hair behind her ear. I'm Agnes Holloway. You can call me Holly, though. I don't understand why my parents named me Agnes. It's a horrible name, isn't it? They said it was my great-great-great-grandmother's name or something. Well, I don't think Agnes is a horrible name. We both got off quite lucky in the name department, if you ask me. My brother is saddled with Albus Severus, James replied, trying his best to get on Holly's good side so we'd have someone to talk to in classes. She had been in potions, too, and seemed to be in his group of Gryffindor first-years. Holly looked at James sideways. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Silence fell over the room, and everyone shifted their gaze to the stairs. James turned his attention to the staircase at the front of the room. A slim woman was descending the stairs, dark hair flowing out behind her. She wore a dark brown skirt and light orange flowing shirt underneath her earth-colored robes. She had wavy black hair, dark tan skin, and piercing blue eyes that shone out against the dark colors. She was quite petite, but had an air about her that made her intimidating despite her small stature. A wide smile spread across her face, and she seemed relatively young, which put James at ease. He'd already had enough of snooty teachers, and it was only the first day of school. So, as you all know, if you manage to find the right classroom, this is Defense Against the Dark Arts, the teacher said as she neared the blackboard in the front of the room. My name is Kefira Torin. She wrote her name on the blackboard. I can assume that the one question you all still have, however, is why is this class necessary? Does anyone have any ideas? Nobody in the room seemed to want to answer her question. None? The room remained silent. It's hard to think of any reasons, isn't it? Many people have argued that this class is pointless because no major threats have occurred in years, including many of my students who just want to lighten their course load. Of course, there are small creatures, but the chance of anyone encountering one is very slim. The biggest threat to wizardkind happened over 10 years ago with Voldemort's rise to power, and since he was defeated by Harry Potter and his friends, nothing else has endangered us. James raised his hand, and Professor Torr nodded at him, signaling that he could speak. What exactly did Harry and his friends do? James asked. It's an excellent question, Mr. James, he replied, slightly embarrassed. James Potter. Professor Torrens' eyes widened a bit at the mention of his last name. Surely he must be joking. He just wants to show off in front of his new friend, she thought. Some kids sent glares in James's direction. They stopped when Professor Torrance cleared her throat. "What kind of idiot are you?" Holly whispered sharply. "How do you not know about what your dad did in the Second Wizarding War? Ask him that. He hasn't told me anything," James replied defensively. "Well, as we all know, the Second Wizarding War occurred because of Voldemort's second rise to power." With the mention of Voldemort's name, some students shifted uneasily in their seats. Professor Torrance plowed on, regardless. "During his control of our world, he attempted to eradicate all Muggle-borns. He infiltrated the Ministry of Magic and changed laws to help ferret them out. His plan, if he had succeeded in dominating the Wizarding world, was to then conquer the Muggle world as well. When Voldemort first returned, the Ministry was in denial. This made it easy for Voldemort and his followers, called Death Eaters, to overthrow the Ministry. The battle, which had previously been on a predominantly political scape due to threatening statements from the corrupted Ministry, turned into an all-out war. The very school you're in sustained immense physical damage. After many unfortunate incidents, Harry finally delivered a fatal blow to Voldemort. He died in the courtyard, and with his death the war ended. Many of the Death Eaters were killed or imprisoned." Hand shot up into the air. James had opened a can of worms. Students were talking amongst themselves, and it took Professor a while to quiet everyone down. Everyone seemed to have an opinion or a story, ranging from quite reasonable to quibbler-worthy. "One at a time, everyone." She pointed at a girl in the front row off to the left a bit. "What does the Ministry of Magic actually do if they couldn't stop you know who? What use are they?" The girl put her hand down. "They're like our government. They make the laws and enforce them. Most of the time they are quite effective, but even the Aura Department was not equipped to handle Voldemort." One boy couldn't wait to be called on, so he shouted out his question. "Did Voldemort have a real name?" Professor Torrance froze, apparently contemplating whether or not to tell them. "Yes, he did. His name was Tom Riddle. He went to Hogwarts and was a member of Slytherin House." After she answered that question, almost all the hands in the room went down, all of them except James's hand. "Yes, Mr. Potter." "Exactly how did Harry kill Voldemort?" James asked. Torrance stayed quiet for a moment. James could see her body tense a bit. "Well, you see, it's a complicated bit of magic. Voldemort did something. It was considered very inhumane, and still is. But he did, Professor Torrance's voice quickly faded away under the locked eyes of 80 students, staring at her for a long time. Their eyes pierced through the silence and seemed to hold her captive. Well, never mind. What he did was bad, and so he died because of it. He was killed in the end with a charm that typically doesn't do bodily harm to any wizard, but because his body was in such bad condition before the charm struck him, and other unusual circumstances, it killed him. We'll be learning more about it as time goes on, but this is not the appropriate time." Students looked around the room, and eventually most all eyes were on James. He looked to Holly, who was looking him dead in the eye with an almost accusing look. "What?" James said. "Nothing." "Okay, everyone, now that we're done with questions, which we are, Mr. Abercrombie, take out your textbooks. We'll be reading a bit about dark creatures and dangerous beasts. Even if they are rare, it is just as important to learn how to handle them as to defend yourselves against other wizards, whether garden variety or dark lords. However, your homework, due any time this term before Christmas break, will be to write a paper of at least 600 words, that's 14 inches, on the tragedy of the Wizarding Wars and why they must never be allowed to happen again, as you seem to be so interested in it." That elicited a collective groan from the class. "I was hoping I would go at least a day without homework," Holly sighed under her breath. James smiled to himself as he pulled out his textbook. "What did you expect? It's school." Homework had preoccupied all Belle's time for too long, delaying her trip to the library. Ever since the first day in potions, she'd been as curious about Harry Potter as she had always been about who her real parents were. The idea that the two topics might be connected remained a tantalizing idea. As time went on, she heard bits and pieces of what Harry did in the Second Wizarding War, but always disjointed and without any real substance to them. Belle was dead set on visiting the library today, and didn't know how much longer she could wait to begin researching her parents. If Aunt Narcissa and Uncle Lucius hadn't kept her in the dark, she wouldn't have to scavenge for information herself. After dinner that evening, Belle dragged Scorpius and Cat with her to the library. They had wanted to go back to the common room and rest before astronomy that night, but Belle insisted that this was the perfect time to begin. It took them longer than they had anticipated to get there, but only because Cat had insisted she knew a shortcut. She didn't. After what felt like days of wandering through the darkening halls of Hogwarts, the trio finally made it to the library. It was larger than any library Belle had ever imagined. She'd never actually seen one, aside from the room in Scorpius's home that had held all the books in her world, and her imagination had apparently failed her in picturing what a real library would look like. The library at Hogwarts was much more incredible than Belle could ever have anticipated. Shelves stretched high up to the arched ceiling, far above their heads. There were small tables between each shelf, so students could work without having to leave the section they were looking into. Small desk lamps sat on the tables, so one could do late-night research. Books flew this way and that, placing themselves back on shelves. Belle wondered if the library even needed a librarian. Regardless, there was one. Madame Pince sat studiously behind a large desk, thin wire-rimmed glasses halfway down the bridge of her nose. Her dark brown and steely hair was pulled back in a tight bun. When Belle placed her hand on the desk, Madame Pince looked up from the book she was reading. Closing the book, she set it down next to a stereotypically pointy hat and addressed Belle coldly. "How may I help you?" I would like to see any books pertaining to the Second Wizarding War, please," Belle said. Scorpius nudged her a bit and she stood straighter. "Also, how many books are we allowed to check out at a time?" Madame Pince scanned her eyes on a list, although Belle doubted she needed to. "Any books on the Second Wizarding War will be in recent Wizarding history, somewhere around rows 27 to 40. Look at the sides of the bookshelves for an index of books on the shelf. You may check out 2 books per student at a time. Just be sure to come tell me about it before you go waltzing out of the library with any of my books." Madame Pince looked down at Belle, Scorpius, and Cat with a stern eye and pointed them in the direction of the section. "Thank you, ma'am." Belle turned on her heels and started walking briskly towards the recent Wizarding history. "All right, guys, we don't have a lot of time since the library closes at 10. We need to cover as much of it as we can and check out the most promising ones we find." "Belle, we have astronomy tonight," Cat complained. "Why can't we do this tomorrow night or this weekend?" "Because haven't we been trying to figure this out for years? Besides, we still have Torrin's Christmas present to deal with," Scorpius reasoned. "Don't snap, Scorp. I understand where she's coming from. I know it's a rotten timing with astronomy and being up until 1 in the morning, but this is the first time we've had, and I need your help. Besides, you guys are just as curious as I am. They've been lying to you, too," Belle said as she wove her way through the labyrinthine shelves. She chose a book off the shelf titled The War of the Century by Miriam Whittaker. It was a sizable book, and with one glance at the table of contents, Belle could tell it might be useful. She flipped through the page that pertained to specific Death Eaters involved in the war and turned to Scorpius and Cat. "Look for any books about Death Eater incidents or books about specific Death Eaters. Find 2 books each, and then we're out of here." Scorpius and Cat spread out in opposite directions, and Belle continued to rifle through the books in her spot, searching desperately for answers. She was looking for a book on Death Eaters because that had to be what her parents had been. Nothing else made sense, and there was nowhere else to start. No matter how hard she tried, however, she couldn't find anything exclusively about Death Eaters. Belle flipped through what seemed to be hundreds of books, skimming pages for names or families, anything specific. She found nothing. It was as if history was in denial. Although a small part of her screamed a bit on the inside, she made an extremely exasperated noise that was only slightly louder than she intended. Heads turned, James's including. He was apparently researching the First Wizarding War for Turan's essay, and in an instant, Scorpius and Cat came around the corner. "Belle," Cat gently put a hand on her shoulder. "I don't get it. There's nothing. Nothing! There's not a single thing that seems relevant. What if it's something awful, and that's why they didn't tell us?" Belle cried. Tears stung the backs of her eyes. She had been waiting and wondering for too long to accept nothing, but finding out would be almost as bad. "Hey, Belle, it's okay." Scorpius hugged Belle tightly, and as he let go, put both hands firmly on her shoulders. "You're tired, but there's got to be something, I promise." "There isn't nothing. I promise we'll find out who your parents are, all right? Besides, I know you. You won't be happy accepting an unanswered question for long." Belle nodded her head. "Okay. Belle, trust me. We will find out." Cat smiled. "But if you don't mind, I found my 2 books, and I'm going to go tell Madame Pince that I'm checking them out so I won't fall asleep in astronomy." With Cat hurrying ahead of them, Belle and Scorpius trailed out of the library, a stack of hefty books held precariously in a pile in Scorpius's arms.